You know El Chapo. You've seen the documentaries, the tunnels, the Netflix series, the trial. But here's what almost nobody tells you. El Chapo was not the beginning. He was the product, a junior enforcer, a mid-level operator, a man who rose to global infamy only because someone else built the road he drove on. Before the Sinaloa cartel existed, before the Tijuana cartel, the Juarez cartel, and half the criminal organizations currently tearing Mexico apart, there was one cartel that ran it all. One man who united them. One organization so powerful, so strategically built, that when it finally fell, it didn't disappear. It exploded. And every cartel that followed was just a piece of the shrapnel. This is the story of the Guadalajara cartel, the cartel that trained El Chapo. And the reason nobody talks about it anymore is the most chilling part of the whole story. To understand the Guadalajara cartel, you have to understand the man who built it, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Born January 8, 1946, in Culiacán, Sinaloa, the same region that would later become the heart of Mexican drug trafficking. His early life was not what you'd expect for someone who would become the most powerful criminal in Mexican history. He was educated. He studied business in college. And then he did something that would define his entire career. He became a cop. Specifically, he became an agent for the Mexican Federal Judicial Police. And then he became a bodyguard. Not just for anyone, for the governor of Sinaloa himself, Leopoldo Sánchez Celis. Félix Gallardo grew so close to the governor's family that he became godfather to the governor's child. Think about what that means. This wasn't some street-level criminal who clawed his way up through violence. This was a man with political connections at the highest level of state government. A man who understood, from the very beginning, that the real power wasn't in the drugs, it was in the relationships. His job in those early years wasn't running drugs himself. It was brokering corruption, introducing drug traffickers to government officials, building the bridge between the underworld and the state. He was essentially a fixer, a man who made problems disappear, not through violence, but through connections. And when his mentor, the original Sinaloa drug lord Pedro Avilés Pérez, was killed in a police shootout in 1978, Félix Gallardo didn't mourn. He moved. He took over the business. He absorbed the roots. He inherited the network. And he had a vision none of his predecessors had. Not a local operation. Not a state operation, a national monopoly. In the late 1970s, the Mexican government launched Operation Condor, a military-led eradication campaign targeting the drug-producing areas of Sinaloa and the Sierra Madre Mountains. Helicopters, soldiers, crop destruction. For the small, scattered drug operations of the time, it was catastrophic. But for Félix Gallardo, it was an opportunity. As traffickers fled the mountains and regrouped in Guadalajara, a major western city far from the crackdown, he was already there waiting for them. Around 1980, he united three key players under one roof. Rafael Caro Quintero, a fiery, brutal operator from a family with deep roots in trafficking. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Neto, the elder statesman of the group, experienced, connected, and dangerous. And Félix Gallardo himself, the strategist, the diplomat, the man with the political cover. Together, they formed what the DEA would later call the Guadalajara cartel. Though it's worth noting, they never called themselves that. The name was coined by American law enforcement. To themselves, they were simply the Federation. And what a federation it was. Their primary product at first was marijuana. Enormous quantities of it, including the jaw-dropping Rancho Bufalo, a marijuana plantation in the Chihuahua Desert so vast it reportedly covered 2,500 acres and reportedly produced up to $8 billion in product annually. To protect it, they didn't rely on guns alone. They had something more valuable: the DFS, the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, Mexico's intelligence agency and secret police, essentially provided the cartel with a protection umbrella. Police protection, intelligence cover, political insulation. This wasn't a criminal organization hiding from the government. It was a criminal organization embedded inside the government. But marijuana was just the beginning. In the early 1980s, American law enforcement cracked down hard on the Caribbean drug routes. The pathways Colombian cocaine cartels had been using to flood the United States through Florida. The Colombians needed an alternative. Felix Gallardo had been watching. Through a Honduran trafficker named Juan Mata Ballesteros, the Guadalajara cartel made contact with the Colombian cocaine suppliers. The deal they struck was historic. The Guadalajara cartel would transport Colombian cocaine through Mexico into the United States. In exchange, they wouldn't take cash. They took product. 50% of every cocaine shipment. Think about what that means financially. By the mid-1980s, the network was estimated to be pulling in approximately $5 billion annually. El Chapo, the young man from Badiraguato, Sinaloa, who'd grown up poor and started selling drugs as a teenager, was now an enforcer inside this machine. By the early 1980s, he was working for the Federation under Felix Gallardo's command, learning the routes, learning the system, learning how a cartel was actually built. He was a student. Felix Gallardo was the professor. By 1984, the Guadalajara cartel was untouchable. Or so they thought. His name was Enrique Kiki Camarena, a DEA special agent assigned to Guadalajara, originally from Mexico, who had become an American citizen and dedicated his career to fighting the drug trade. Working through informants, Camarena had been doing something the cartel considered unforgivable. He was exposing them. In 1984, his intelligence work helped Mexican soldiers locate and destroy Rancho Bufalo, the cartel's enormous marijuana plantation. The raid burned more than 10,000 tons of marijuana. The estimated loss to the cartel was $160 million in a single operation. The cartel was furious. And in the cartel's world, fury had only one response. On February 7, 1985, Jalisco police officers on the cartel's payroll abducted Kiki Camarena as he left the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara in broad daylight. His Mexican pilot, Alfredo Zavala Avelar, was taken shortly after. They were brought to a house owned by Rafael Caro Quintero. What followed over the next 30 hours was the kind of event that changes history. Camarena and Avelar were tortured and interrogated. On February 9, 1985, Kiki Camarena was murdered. When the DEA found his remains a month later, 70 miles outside Guadalajara, the United States government did not respond quietly. The American public was outraged. The DEA was outraged. And for the first time, the full weight of American diplomatic and law enforcement pressure came down on Mexico. The U.S. temporarily closed the Mexican border. Diplomats demanded action. Operation Leyenda, one of the largest DEA investigations in history, was launched specifically to pursue everyone involved in Camarena's murder. Within weeks, Rafael Caro Quintero was arrested. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo was arrested. 2 of the 3 founders of the Guadalajara cartel were gone. Only Felix Gallardo remained, And he did something extraordinary. He went quiet. While law enforcement hunted for him, Felix Gallardo moved his family. He kept a low profile. He used his political connections to stay ahead of every investigation. For 4 years after Camarena's murder, as his 2 co-founders rotted in prison, he continued operating. 4 years. The man the DEA wanted most was hiding in plain sight, protected by the very government officials he'd spent a decade cultivating relationships with. But he knew his time was running out. And before it did, he made the decision that would reshape Mexican organized crime forever. In 1989, Felix Gallardo instructed his lawyer to arrange a meeting. Not a small meeting, a summit. At a house in the resort city of Acapulco, Felix Gallardo gathered the top drug traffickers of Mexico, his plaza bosses, his lieutenants, the men who ran each corridor. And then he divided the country. Like a CEO restructuring a company before going to prison, he carved Mexico into territories and handed them out. The Tijuana corridor went to the Arellano Felix brothers. They became the Tijuana Cartel. The Ciudad Juarez corridor went to the Carrillo Fuentes family. They became the Juarez Cartel. The Matamoros and Gulf Coast corridor was left to Juan Garcia Abrego. He expanded it into the Gulf Cartel. And the Pacific Coast operations, the Sinaloa corridor, went to Ismael El Mayo Zambada, Héctor El Güero Palma Salazar, and a rising enforcer named Joaquín Guzmán Loera, El Chapo. The student had just inherited a kingdom, except it wasn't a kingdom anymore. It was a fragment. Felix Gallardo's logic was sound. By decentralizing, he believed the overall trade would survive even if one piece was targeted by law enforcement. No single arrest could take down the whole network. What he didn't predict, or perhaps couldn't stop, was what decentralization actually creates. Competition. Without a central authority holding everyone to a peace agreement, the plaza bosses who had once cooperated under the Federation immediately began fighting each other. Within months, El Chapo and the Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel were at war. A war that would kill hundreds of people and eventually see El Chapo arrested in Guatemala in 1993 after a gun battle at the Guadalajara airport accidentally killed a Catholic cardinal. The Juarez cartel and the Sinaloa cartel clashed over routes. The Gulf cartel created its own enforcement army, what would become the Zetas, because it needed muscle to survive. Every major cartel conflict in Mexican history since 1989 traces directly back to that meeting in Acapulco. The Mexican drug war, which has killed more than 120,000 people since 2006 by some estimates, didn't begin with El Chapo. It began when Felix Gallardo dismantled the one structure that was keeping the violence organized. On April 8, 1989, Mexican authorities finally arrested Felix Gallardo. Not in some dramatic raid, not after a gunfight. They came to his home. He was reportedly still in his bathrobe. He later wrote about it in his prison diary, published by Gato Pardo magazine in 2009. 3 officers came at him and knocked him to the ground with rifle butts. Men he had known since 1971. Men he had once trusted. He was worth an estimated $500 million at the time of his arrest. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison for ordering the murder of Kiki Camarena. But even prison didn't stop him immediately. From behind bars, Felix Gallardo continued directing operations via mobile phone, coordinating, mediating, maintaining his networks, until authorities finally cut off his access. In 2017, after already serving nearly 28 years, A new trial added an additional 37 years to his sentence. As of today, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, El Padrino, the Godfather, is in his late 70s, in declining health, and has been transferred to a medium security facility. The cartel he built is gone. The Federation is gone. But everything it created? Still very much alive. The Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo's cartel, became the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world, operating in more than 50 countries. The Tijuana cartel survived decades of warfare. The Gulf cartel spawned the Zetas, who became one of the most violent organizations in the Western Hemisphere. And out of the ashes of all of them, new cartels grew. The CJNG, the Beltran Leyva organization, the Chapitos. So why doesn't anyone talk about the Guadalajara cartel? Partly, it's because the story doesn't have the visual drama of what came after. No dramatic tunnel escapes. No running gun battles through jungle terrain. Félix Gallardo was a businessman more than a gunman, and businessmen don't make for as exciting a thumbnail. Partly, it's because the story is inconvenient. Because explaining where all these cartels came from forces you to talk about the corruption of Mexican government institutions. The DFS, the politicians, the police officers who were on the payroll. And that's a harder story to tell than one villain in a room. But mostly, nobody talks about the Guadalajara cartel because everyone is too busy covering what it became. The Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo, El Mayo, the Chapitos. They're all descendants, all children of the Federation. And here is the number that puts the whole thing in perspective. El Chapo, the most famous drug lord in modern history, was the student. His teacher built the entire system El Chapo used to become what he became, and died in prison, largely forgotten outside of academic papers and one Netflix series. The man who invented the modern Mexican drug trade is sitting in a medium security prison in his late 70s. The machine he built is still running. That's the Guadalajara cartel. That's the cartel nobody talks about anymore. And now you know. If this is the kind of story you've been looking for, the stories behind the stories, the people the headlines skipped over, then Stickwire is your channel. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, because next week we're going deeper, and we're just getting started.